Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. I had the privilege of hearing George Buttrick, who was a professor and chaplain at Harvard University when I was there. And on one occasion he preached a sermon which I have never forgotten. It's a sermon that dealt with Albert Camus' The Fall. Some of you probably know that short novel, about 160 pages or so. And in it he talks about, where he addresses some questions to John the Baptist. You can see the religious themes, the fall, referring to the fall of mankind, and then John Baptiste, John the Baptist. And John the Baptist on several occasions has a monologue where he's talking to a stranger who finally, quote, becomes his friend. And in the process, they discuss various issues, and it comes out that John Baptiste thinks that he's pretty much a perfect person. In fact, John Baptiste says that he has been an eminent attorney who has spent all of his life defending those individuals who need to be defended. And furthermore, he goes on to say that he not only helps people in a legal way, but he also helps people, especially blind people, across the street. And he goes on to talk about all the ways in which he is, quote, perfect. But then he describes several events which occur, which really raise a question in his mind about his own status. On one occasion, he is going and walking across a bridge, and he sees a woman standing there dark, and he doesn't say anything to her, and he goes on, and the woman then jumps into the river. And he knows exactly what has happened. And if he had reacted more quickly, he probably could have saved this woman, but he hesitated. And then he thought, well, it's too late anyway. And he didn't even try. And so he, for the first time, confronts his cowardice. And then on another occasion, he has interpreted relationships, love, as essentially being sexual. And the mistress decides that she will no longer be his mistress. And then he decides, well, now that she no longer wants me, I bet I can get her back. And so he makes a big effort to get her back and wins her back, all for vanity, vanity, and vanity. And then the third occasion, which he describes, is when he is in an accident, or almost an accident. He comes to stop behind a motorcycle, and he can't move any further. And when he can't move any further, he gets out of the car, and he starts sort of what in our day we would call road rage, and he gets involved with the motorcycle driver who hits him, and he doesn't do anything in response. And when he goes home, he runs through his mind all the ways in which he would have and could have and should have reacted, most of them violent, most of them physical, most of them trying to take out his anger on the motorcycle driver. And he, for the first time, confronts his violence. The book goes on to describe, even though Camus does not believe that there is such a thing as sin, the book goes on to describe exactly what you and I know to be sin. And so the question arises for us today: do we today have the same attitude that Jean Baptiste had and that Camus had, which was to believe that there really is no sin? It just depends on a matter of definition. Just think about all the different ways in which we have decided that some action which once was sin no longer is. I mentioned previously a cartoon, one of my favorite cartoons, about these guys who are sitting in hell. And one of them says to the other one, he said, what really bothers me is that what I'm in here for is no longer a sin. And so we today, I think, have taken our lives and we have reinterpreted our lives to redefine our actions so that we come out looking almost perfect, thinking that we, as individuals and as a society, can make us perfect. But is that really true? Don't we have to confront the reality in our society today that we have so much sinfulness, so much brokenness in our society? The paper for the USA Today, the weekend edition, this came out today. The headline is, "Terrorists Kill 147 at the Kenyan School." And that's not the first time we've had headlines where terrorists have killed. But I want to suggest to each one of us that there is a little terrorist in each one of us. There's somebody who's capable of violence, somebody who's capable of sin. And that is, in our tradition, we refer to that, Luther referred to that in Latin as simul justus et peccator. We are simultaneously just and saved. Our brothers in the Reformed tradition who follow Calvin and John Knox, depending upon which part of the tradition you're focusing on, they will tell you that they believe that man is totally depraved. And what they mean by that is not that we are utterly depraved. They make a distinction. The distinction is this: Hitler could have been far worse than he was. He was obviously very bad. That sounds even so hollow, so shallow. He was obviously a horrendous maniac, let me put it that way. And Hitler, however, could have been worse. And that is the difference between total depravity and utter depravity. Utter depravity is that you are so bad that you could not be worse. Total depravity is that there is nothing that we do which is not tinged with our fallenness, which not in some way is depraved. So we're not as bad as we could be, but we are also not as good as we should be. And that's the nature of the fall that this was discussed by Camus, and that I think we often discuss here. The Bible puts it this way. It says in Romans 23, Paul writes that in fact we all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There isn't anyone who is an exception. Regardless of how wonderful that person is, regardless of how beautiful that person appears, regardless of how generous that person is, we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And that's what we have to begin to understand if we were one to understand the cross of Good Friday. We first have to acknowledge and recognize our sinfulness. There's a professor by the name of Ralph Wood who is at Baylor University. And he, on various occasions, has taught seminarians at Baylor. And he would often ask the university students, the seminary students, tell me, he said, which one is closer to the truth? The college student who believes that we are basically good and that we just sort of need some work on us to make us a little better, to sort of shine our shoes a little bit more, to live a better life, or the young pagan man who sacrifices chickens on a makeshift altar. And when they work their way through that issue, they begin to recognize that the young pagan who worships and takes a chicken and puts it on the altar is closer to the truth than the young person who believes that sin is just a figment of our imagination, is just a figment of our superstition. Why? Because the young person who sacrifices the chicken on an altar recognizes not only his sin, but also realizes that they cannot deal with that sin by themselves, that they are incapable of being sinless, that they are incapable of changing their lives. Regardless of how much you and I try, we will always be put in the position where we are not capable of dealing with our own sin, regardless of how much we try. There's only one way that our sin can be dealt with, and that's through the cross of Christ. And so we come to the text that I read today, and the last verse, let me read it again. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." What is finished? Well, the first thing that's finished is the fact that he was no longer going to suffer. The second thing that was finished is the work that his Father had assigned to him. We read in the 5th chapter of John, the 6th chapter of John, and the 12th chapter of John, and all the way through John and the other Gospels, we realize that Jesus is here on a mission. He's here on an assignment. He's been given work by the Father. And the work that he's been given is the third thing that is finished, and that is that Jesus has been crucified for each one of us and for everyone in the world. And so Jesus is saying, it is finished. And by saying that, he is telling us that he has redeemed us. In fact, the Greek word that was borrowed from the commercial language that was in use at that time. The Greek word is tetelestai. And here in this particular chapter, it's the only place where it is used. And tetelestai was actually the word that was stamped onto the business transaction when it said paid in full. So if somebody owed a debt to another person and paid that debt, they would stamp on that document tetelestai. It has been paid in full. And so when Jesus is saying it is finished, he is telling us that you and I can be reassured and can rest in him, because whatever penalty we were to receive has been paid in full by him. And that's the beauty of the cross. But you know, I have a problem, and I'm not sure how I'm going to address this. I thought about it, and I decided that 2 or 3 different ways that I was going to address it, and decided against it. So let me just be direct. One of the problems that I have, I don't mean a personal problem, or maybe it is a personal problem. One of the difficulties or problems that I have is when the cross is worn as jewelry. I have to be honest with you. When the cross is worn as jewelry, it says to me that we think of it as an accessory. I know that there are people who say, well, that gives me an opportunity to witness and tell people that I am a Christian by wearing that cross. And that probably is a very good thing. And I know there are some people, for instance, not too long ago, I was meeting with somebody and they had a cross on, and I said, gee, that's a unique kind of cross. What's the story behind it? And they said, well, I wear unique crosses so that people like you, when they see me, can ask me about it and I can tell them about Jesus. And so there are all sorts of ways of explaining that. But fundamentally, I have a problem when we use what has been a horrible, horrible killing process, when we use that in a way that negates the very thing that the cross stands for, when it is just an accessory. Let me read you something which for me captures what I'm saying. And it also captures for me the fact that Christ did such an incredible work on the cross. I simply argue, this is by George MacLeod, who was a Scottish pastor, or was a Scottish pastor, founder of the Iona community in Scotland. And he writes, I simply argue that the cross should be raised at the center of the marketplace as well as on the steeple of the church. I'm recovering the claim that Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between 2 candles, but on a cross between 2 thieves. On the town's garbage heap, at a crossroads so cosmopolitan that they had to write his title in Hebrew and Latin and Greek. At the kind of place where cynics talk smut, and thieves curse, and soldiers gamble, because that is where he died. And that is what he died for. And that is what he died about. That is where churchmen ought to be, and what churchmen